In 1886, a 22-year-old railroad station agent in North Redwood, Minnesota, received an unclaimed shipment of pocket watches. The local jeweler had refused to sign for them. The watches sat in the station. Richard Sears looked at the watches and made a calculation. He could sell them to other station agents down the line. He wrote letters. The watches moved. He made $5,000 in 6 months and never went back to the railroad. That single decision, a young man turning an unclaimed shipment into a business, produced what became the most important retail institution in American history. Sears, Roebuck and Company was, for most of the 20th century, the store where America bought its tools, its appliances, its clothing, its furniture, and occasionally its house. The Sears catalogue sold prefabricated kit homes by mail order. You could order an entire house from the catalogue, and it would arrive by rail, every component labelled, and you would build it yourself. 110,000 Americans did exactly that between 1908 and 1940. At its peak, Sears employed 350,000 people and operated 4,000 stores. Its Chicago headquarters, the Sears Tower, was the tallest building in the world when it opened in 1973. It remained the tallest in the world until 1998. The company was, for decades, the largest private sector employer in the United States. It was larger than General Motors in terms of customers served. It was, as several business historians have described it, the Amazon of its time, the Walmart of its time, the institution through which the American middle class obtained the material goods of its life. As of June 2025, Sears had 5 stores left in the United States. 5. This is the story of how that happened. It is also the story of a hedge fund manager who bought a dying company, extracted billions of dollars from it while it died, and then bought the carcass for himself. And it is the story of what that transaction tells you about who wins when American institutions collapse. Richard Sears was not the kind of businessman who built carefully and slowly. He was a salesman, brilliant at it, with an instinct for what people wanted and a gift for the specific language of desire that catalogue copy required. The early Sears catalogues were not dry lists of products. They were written in a voice that spoke directly to the rural American customer who had been paying inflated prices at the local general store, because the general store was the only option available. Sears offered an alternative. The catalogue was the alternative. You could order almost anything, and it would come to you by mail at a price that undercut the local merchant who had been overcharging you for years. This was, in its structure, the same disruption that Amazon would later execute on a different set of merchants. The catalogue eliminated the middleman. It connected the manufacturer to the customer directly, at a price that the middleman's margin had previously prevented. Rural Americans, who had never had access to the variety of goods available in cities, suddenly had access to all of it, delivered to their nearest railroad station. The catalogue sold watches, then jewellery, then clothing, then furniture, then hardware, then appliances, then automobiles, then houses. By 1900, annual sales exceeded $11 million. By 1906, when the company went public, it was one of the largest businesses in America. Julius Rosenwald, who had bought out Alva Roebuck's interest in 1895 and reorganized the company's finances, was the operational mind behind the growth. Richard Sears had the salesman's instinct. Rosenwald had the executive's discipline. Together they built a logistics infrastructure, warehouses, rail connections, sorting systems that could handle the volume the catalogue was generating. Sears retired in 1909. Rosenwald continued. The company continued. What Rosenwald understood, and what the successive generations of Sears management understood through the middle of the 20th century, was that Sears was not primarily a retail company. It was a trust relationship with the American middle class. The customer who bought a Kenmore washing machine trusted that it would last, that it would be serviced, that if something went wrong with it, Sears would make it right. That trust had been built over decades and was worth more than any individual product line. The specific structure of what Lampert did at Sears Holdings becomes clearer when you trace the money flows rather than the management decisions. In the years between 2005 and 2018, Sears Holdings lost approximately $11.7 billion in operating value. The company's revenues declined every single year after 2006. Its stores deteriorated because capital investment was consistently deferred. Its employees left because wages were not competitive, and the working conditions in declining stores were demoralizing. Its suppliers became wary because a company that loses money every year eventually cannot pay its bills. All of this is consistent with simple retail failure. The question is whether the failure was being managed or accelerated. Several former Sears executives gave testimony or interviews in the period surrounding the bankruptcy that described a management philosophy under Lampert that they found unusual for a retail operation. Investment in stores was systematically cut. Marketing budgets were reduced. Lampert managed the company through a system called MIOM, manage your own money, in which different business units competed against each other for internal capital. Former executives described this as creating a culture of internal competition that prevented the cooperation that retail operations require, where the appliance department and the clothing department and the auto center need to function as parts of a unified customer experience rather than as separate profit centers fighting over resources. Lampert ran a company with hundreds of thousands of employees from a location that was not a Sears store. He communicated with his executive team primarily through video conference. Former executives described difficulty getting decisions made because access to Lampert was limited, and the decisions he made through video were sometimes reversed or modified when his attention moved elsewhere. The contrast with what was actually needed, a retail turnaround that required deep engagement with store operations, supplier relationships, and customer experience, was complete. Meanwhile, the transactions that benefited ESL continued. The Seritage sale leaseback in 2015 generated $2.7 billion that reduced the company's debt load. It also transferred the company's most appreciating assets, its real estate, to an entity that Lampert controlled. As Sears stores closed, Seritage redeveloped those properties into mixed-use real estate. The locations where Sears had operated for decades, in suburban shopping centers across America, became more valuable as the stores themselves became worthless. Seritage, which Lampert chaired, benefited from the real estate value that Sears had accumulated over a century. Sears, which was paying rent to Seritage, continued to decline. The bankruptcy filing in October 2018 was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the financial statements. It was the endpoint of a trajectory that had been visible for years. What was less visible was the specific question that the bankruptcy estate's lawyers began to ask. In the transactions that had moved value out of Sears and into entities that Lampert controlled, had the proper legal standards been met? The bankruptcy estate's suit alleged that they had not. The settlement of $175 million suggested that the question was, at minimum, worth a significant sum to resolve. The Craftsman tool brand, which Sears introduced in 1927, came with a lifetime guarantee. Any Craftsman tool that broke would be replaced. No questions asked. This was not a marketing promise. It was a policy that Sears honored consistently for nearly a century. People kept their Craftsman tools for their entire lives and passed them to their children. That is what trust looks like when it is maintained over time. The specific moment when Sears began to lose is debated by business historians, but the evidence points to the 1970s, when two things happened simultaneously that the company's management did not fully address. The first was Walmart. Sam Walton had opened his first Walmart in 1962 in Rogers, Arkansas. By the 1970s, Walmart was expanding across the rural South and Midwest with a specific strategy. Locate in smaller towns that Sears had not prioritized, offer lower prices through aggressive supply negotiation, and keep costs low enough that the margin on each sale, though thin, compounded across enormous volume. Walmart was not, in the 1970s, a threat to Sears in the way that it would later become. It was a regional discount retailer operating in markets that Sears considered secondary. The Sears management looked at Walmart and did not see what it was becoming. The second thing was the credit card. Sears had launched the Sears card, one of the first retail credit cards in America, and by the 1970s a significant portion of the company's profit was coming not from selling goods, but from the interest charged on the credit balances its customers were carrying. The financial services operation was, by some measures, more profitable than the retail operation. This was a warning sign that the retail operation was not as healthy as it appeared, because it was being subsidized by financing income. Sears management read it as a strength. By the 1980s, Walmart had grown large enough to challenge Sears directly. The price advantage Walmart maintained through its logistics systems and its supplier relationships was not something Sears could easily match. Sears had invested in its stores, its service infrastructure, its trained employees. Walmart had invested in logistics and supply chain and had kept everything else as lean as possible. Lean beats invested if the customer's primary concern is price. The Sears customer who had bought Kenmore appliances and Craftsman tools for 20 years was also a customer who noticed when Walmart offered a comparable product for significantly less money. The trust relationship had value, but it had limits. Sears responded to the Walmart threat in the way that large institutions typically respond to existential threats: slowly, partially, and with more confidence in its existing advantages than the evidence warranted. It diversified. In 1981, Sears acquired Coldwell Banker, a real estate company, and Dean Witter, a financial services firm. The idea was to become a financial services superstore, a place where you could buy a refrigerator and arrange a mortgage and invest your savings in the same afternoon. The Sears financial centers opened inside stores. Financial advisors sat at desks next to the hardware department. The experiment did not work. The customers who came to Sears to buy appliances were not the customers who wanted to discuss their investment portfolios while standing in a store that smelled like rubber flooring and motor oil. The financial services integration was sold off in the early 1990s at significant cost, having consumed management attention and capital that might have been spent addressing the actual threat. By 1990, Walmart had surpassed Sears as the largest retailer in America. The institution that had been the largest retailer for nearly a century was no longer the largest retailer. The Sears management acknowledged this and continued managing the company as if the situation were recoverable through the tools that had worked in the past: cost-cutting, store renovation, catalog optimization. The Sears catalog deserves more than a mention because it was not merely a commercial document. It was a social institution that shaped how Americans understood what was available to them and what they were entitled to want. The catalogue arrived twice a year, spring and fall, in a package heavy enough that children in rural households used it as a booster seat. It ran to several hundred pages. It contained everything: shoes, dresses, suits, furniture, firearms, bicycles, automobiles, farm equipment, medicine, musical instruments. You could order a bicycle and a shotgun and a piano in the same envelope. For a farmer's family in rural Iowa in 1905, the catalogue was the only window onto a consumer world that urban Americans took for granted. The local general store carried what the store owner decided to stock. The catalogue carried everything. The prices in the catalogue undercut the local store on most items, because Sears was buying at volume and passing the savings to the customer. This was the Amazon model. Sears did not call it that because Amazon did not exist. But the disruption was identical. A company that aggregated demand at a scale that allowed it to extract better prices from suppliers, passing those prices to consumers, and in the process making the incumbent local merchants uncompetitive. The catalogue also sold houses. Between 1908 and 1940, Sears sold approximately 110,000 prefabricated kit homes through the catalogue. You selected a model, paid for it, and Sears shipped the components by rail, 30,000 pieces of lumber and other materials, each piece pre-cut and numbered, with a 75-page instruction manual. The homes came with plumbing and wiring. They were, by the standards of the time, well designed and durable. Many of them are still standing. The Sears Modern Home program was the company's most ambitious demonstration of what the catalogue model could do. It turned housing from a locally negotiated, contractor-dependent process into something you could order from a book and assemble with a reasonably skilled crew. The democratization of decent housing was not the primary motivation. Profit was the primary motivation, but the effect was real and it was large. Rosenwald, who ran the company's operations through its most expansive period, understood that Sears' relationship with rural America was not merely commercial. The company was providing access. The family that had never been able to afford certain goods, that had been dependent on what the local merchant chose to carry at prices the local merchant chose to charge, was suddenly connected to a national market. This was the specific nature of the trust the company built. It was not just trust in the quality of individual products. It was trust that the company was on the customer's side in the transaction, working to get them the best possible product at the best possible price, rather than extracting maximum margin because it could. That trust took decades to build. It was the company's most valuable asset. It was not on any balance sheet. The catalogue itself was discontinued in 1993, after 105 years. The decision was presented as a rational response to changing consumer behavior. It was also the elimination of the thing that had originally made Sears what it was, the direct relationship with the customer, delivered to their door at a price they could not get locally. Amazon launched in 1994, the year after the catalogue ended. The period between 1970 and 1990 is the period in which Sears should have responded to Walmart and did not, and the specific reasons why it did not tell you something about how large institutions fail. Sears in 1970 was an organization with a deeply established way of doing things. It had systems, processes, supplier relationships, and management practices that had been refined over 80 years. These systems worked. They had produced the largest retailer in America and kept it there for decades. The people who ran these systems were competent professionals who had spent their careers making them work better. Walmart's approach was not better in every dimension. Walmart's stores were not as well appointed as Sears. Walmart's employees were not as well trained in product knowledge or customer service. Walmart's brand selection was narrower. By the standards that Sears had developed over 80 years, Walmart was doing retail worse. It was doing one thing better. It was doing price better. Sam Walton had built his logistics operation, the trucks and the distribution centers, and the supplier relationships, with a single obsessive focus on reducing the cost of getting a product from a manufacturer to a customer. Every cent he could take out of that process went into the price reduction he could offer. He was not interested in trained sales staff. He was not interested in elaborate store layouts. He was interested in moving goods from warehouses to checkout registers at a cost no competitor could match. Sears saw this and made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, looked like denial but at the time felt like strategy. It invested in store improvement rather than supply chain improvement, because its stores were the visible face of the trust relationship with customers, and improving them seemed like a response to the Walmart threat. It invested in its financial services businesses, because those were profitable and seemed to represent a diversification that would reduce dependence on retail margin. It invested in its brand names, Kenmore and Craftsman and DieHard, because those brands carried real loyalty and real price premiums that Walmart could not replicate with generic products. None of these investments addressed the specific advantage Walmart was building, the supply chain advantage, the cost of goods advantage, the ability to price below where Sears could price, while still maintaining profitability. By the time Sears management acknowledged the scale of the Walmart threat, the advantage was too large to close through the tools Sears had available. You cannot outinvest a logistics operation that has been building for 30 years in the space of 5. The moment at which Walmart surpassed Sears as the largest retailer in America, 1990, was not a sudden reversal. It was the culmination of a process that had been running for 20 years, while Sears managed its existing strengths rather than building new ones. In 2003, a hedge fund manager named Eddie Lampert began buying Kmart. Kmart had filed for bankruptcy protection in January 2002, the largest retail bankruptcy in American history at that time. Its stock was worthless. Its stores were declining. Its management had failed to respond to Walmart and Target with the speed the situation required. The company was, by any conventional analysis, a bad investment. Lampert did not make conventional analyses. He had founded ESL Investments in 1988 at the age of 25, backed initially by Texas billionaire Richard Rainwater, and had built a reputation over 15 years as one of the sharpest value investors of his generation. David Geffen had invested with him, and told Fortune magazine that he had made more money with Lampert than in all the businesses he had created and sold. Michael Dell had invested. The Tisch family had invested. The press called Lampert the next Warren Buffett. He bought Kmart's distressed debt during the bankruptcy proceedings, which gave him a significant position in the reorganized company when it emerged from bankruptcy in 2003. He engineered a turnaround plan, closed underperforming stores, cut costs, and within 2 years had taken the stock from essentially zero to a substantial valuation. Then he did something that even his admirers found audacious. He used Kmart, a company that had just emerged from bankruptcy, as the acquisition vehicle to purchase Sears, a profitable, essentially debt-free American institution with $89 billion in assets, and a name that was still, in 2004, one of the most recognized in the country. The deal closed in 2005. Sears Holdings Corporation was formed. Lampert became chairman. The combined company had approximately 350,000 employees and operated more than 3,500 stores. Lampert was going to turn Sears around the way he had turned Kmart around. He did not turn Sears around. What Lampert did at Sears Holdings between 2005 and 2018 is the subject of ongoing legal and financial dispute, with his supporters arguing that he was attempting a genuine turnaround that failed due to circumstances beyond his control, and his critics arguing that he systematically extracted value from the company while it declined, and that the extraction was the point. The evidence available in the public record supports the critics' version more fully than Lampert has acknowledged. The specific mechanism requires attention because it is the detail that turns the Sears story from a tale of retail failure into something more deliberately structured. Lampert, through ESL Investments, controlled Sears Holdings. He was its largest shareholder and from 2013, its CEO. ESL also made loans directly to Sears Holdings. This meant that Sears was paying interest to its own controlling shareholders' hedge fund. When the company needed cash, the cash came from ESL at interest rates that produced returns for ESL. The company's financial distress was, in a specific sense, profitable for the entity that controlled it. In 2015, Lampert created Seritage Growth Properties, a real estate investment trust. Seritage acquired approximately 235 Sears and Kmart store properties in a sale-leaseback transaction valued at approximately $2.7 billion. Sears sold its stores to Seritage and then paid rent to remain in them. The chairman of Seritage was Eddie Lampert. The company sold its real estate to an entity controlled by its own chairman and then paid that entity rent. This transaction reduced the company's debt burden, which was the stated rationale, while simultaneously extracting the company's most valuable long-term asset. Real estate in the locations where Sears had operated, major suburban shopping areas across America, appreciated significantly over subsequent years. The entity that owned that real estate was Seritage. The entity that had sold it and was now paying rent on it was Sears. The specific structure of what Lampert did at Sears Holdings becomes clearer when you trace the money flows rather than the management decisions. In the years between 2005 and 2018, Sears Holdings lost approximately $11.7 billion in operating value. The company's revenues declined every single year after 2006. Its stores deteriorated because capital investment was consistently deferred. Its employees left because wages were not competitive and the working conditions in declining stores were demoralizing. Its suppliers became wary because a company that loses money every year eventually cannot pay its bills. All of this is consistent with simple retail failure. The question is whether the failure was being managed or accelerated. Several former Sears executives gave testimony or interviews in the period surrounding the bankruptcy that described a management philosophy under Lampert that they found unusual for a retail operation. Investment in stores was systematically cut. Marketing budgets were reduced. Lampert managed the company through a system called MYOM, Manage Your Own Money, in which different business units competed against each other for internal capital. Former executives described this as creating a culture of internal competition that prevented the cooperation that retail operations require, where the appliance department and the clothing department and the auto center need to function as parts of a unified customer experience rather than as separate profit centers fighting over resources. Lampert ran a company with hundreds of thousands of employees from a location that was not a Sears store. He communicated with his executive team primarily through video conference. Former executives described difficulty getting decisions made because access to Lampert was limited, and the decisions he made through video were sometimes reversed or modified when his attention moved elsewhere. The contrast with what was actually needed, a retail turnaround that required deep engagement with store operations, supplier relationships, and customer experience, was complete. Meanwhile, the transactions that benefited ESL continued. The Seritage sale-leaseback in 2015 generated $2.7 billion that reduced the company's debt load. It also transferred the company's most appreciating assets, its real estate, to an entity that Lampert controlled. As Sears stores closed, Seritage redeveloped those properties into mixed-use real estate. The locations where Sears had operated for decades, in suburban shopping centers across America, became more valuable as the stores themselves became worthless. Seritage, which Lampert chaired, benefited from the real estate value that Sears had accumulated over a century. Sears, which was paying rent to Seritage, continued to decline. The bankruptcy filing in October 2018 was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the financial statements. It was the end point of a trajectory that had been visible for years. What was less visible was the specific question that the bankruptcy estate's lawyers began to ask. In the transactions that had moved value out of Sears and into entities that Lampert controlled, had the proper legal standards been met? The bankruptcy estate's suit alleged that they had not. The settlement of $175 million suggested that the question was, at minimum, worth a significant sum to resolve. The Craftsman tool brand, which had been one of the most recognized brand names in American hardware for 90 years, was sold to Stanley Black & Decker in 2017 for $900 million. The proceeds flowed out of the retail operation. The Kenmore appliance brand was offered to Lampert's own fund for $400 million. The bankruptcy court eventually found this transaction problematic, and the deal did not close on those terms. The DieHard battery brand was sold in 2019 for $200 million. By the time Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy in October 2018, the company had lost $11.7 billion since 2010, its last profitable year. Its 350,000 employees in 2005 had become 68,000 in 2018. Its 3,500 stores had become 500. 317,000 people had lost their jobs. $11.7 billion in value had been destroyed. The pension fund for Sears employees was underfunded by approximately $1,400 million. When Sears declared bankruptcy, its retirees, the people who had worked at Sears for 30 years and expected the pension they had been promised, were told they would receive reduced benefits because the fund was not adequate to pay what they were owed. Now pay attention to this next part, because it is the part that most coverage of the Sears bankruptcy treated as a footnote. When Sears Holdings filed for bankruptcy in October 2018, the bankruptcy estate, the legal entity responsible for managing what remained and recovering value for creditors, filed suit against Eddie Lampert and ESL Investments. The suit alleged that Lampert had engaged in a series of transactions that had stripped value from Sears in ways that benefited him personally, and his fund at the expense of the company's creditors and employees. The specific transactions cited included the Seritage sale-leaseback, the ESL loans and the interest they generated, the spinning off of brand assets at prices the suit alleged were below their actual value, and various other arrangements that the bankruptcy estate characterized as self-dealing. Lampert denied the allegations. He argued that all transactions had been approved by independent directors, conducted on fair terms, and intended to help the company rather than harm it. In February 2019, Lampert's ESL Investments submitted a bid to purchase the remaining assets of Sears Holdings out of bankruptcy. The bid was approximately $5.2 billion and proposed to keep approximately 425 stores operating. The bankruptcy court approved the sale. Eddie Lampert, whose hedge fund was being sued for allegedly extracting value from Sears in ways that harmed creditors and employees, purchased the remaining Sears assets from the bankruptcy estate. He bought the carcass. The lawsuit was eventually settled in 2019 for approximately $175 million, which ESL paid without admitting wrongdoing. The settlement was described as a recovery for the bankruptcy estate. It represented approximately 1.5% of the $11.7 billion that had been lost. ESL's investors, the people whose money Lampert had managed during the Sears period, had lost significant amounts. David Geffen had gotten out near the peak in 2006. Most of the other big names had followed. The investors who remained as the company declined absorbed the losses. Lampert himself, according to the analysis in Institutional Investor magazine, had collected approximately $2 billion in performance fees from ESL investors during the period when Sears stock was rising, between the merger and 2006. Those fees were paid and kept regardless of what subsequently happened to the underlying investment. The performance fee structure of hedge funds compensates managers on gains, without requiring them to return those fees when the gains reverse. He made approximately $2 billion in fees. He lost an unknown amount of his own capital in the subsequent decline. The net position, by most analyses, was that Lampert personally did significantly better than the investors who had trusted him with their money and the employees who had worked for the company he controlled. The 5 stores that Sears has left, as of 2025, are in locations that suggest the end of something rather than the beginning of anything. The Sears Tower in Chicago was renamed the Willis Tower in 2009, when the building was sold and the new owners sold the naming rights to a British insurance company. The name that had been on the world's tallest building for 36 years was gone. The building remains, the name does not. The Craftsman tools that Americans bought for 3 generations, with their lifetime guarantee, their red and black handles, their specific weight and balance that fathers passed to sons, now belong to Stanley Black & Decker. The lifetime guarantee is honoured, though the terms have been modified and the process for claiming it has changed. The DieHard batteries are now owned by Advance Auto Parts. The Kenmore brand is still licensed to various manufacturers. The pension fund shortfall was partially addressed through the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation, the federal insurance program for pension plans. Retirees who had counted on specific monthly payments received less than they were promised. The difference was absorbed by a federal program funded by premiums from other companies, which is a way of saying it was absorbed by the broader American economy rather than by the people who made the decisions that produced the shortfall. The workers who lost their jobs when the stores closed received standard unemployment assistance and whatever severance the bankruptcy proceedings allowed, which varied significantly by employee and by the specific terms of their employment. 317,000 fewer people were employed by Sears in 2018 than in 2005. Most of them found other work. Some of them did not. The specific stories of the cashiers and auto mechanics and appliance technicians and store managers who built their working lives around an institution that was being systematically dismantled while they worked are not in the court records or the financial press. They are in the communities where the stores closed, in the shopping malls where the Sears anchor tenant vacancy took years to fill or was never filled at all. There is a version of the Sears story in which the company simply failed to adapt to changing consumer preferences and competitive dynamics, and in which Lampert was a capable investor who tried to save an institution that could not be saved, and in which the outcome, while painful for employees and retirees, was the ordinary result of a business that had run its course. That version exists. It has genuine supporters among business historians and financial analysts who have studied the case carefully. There is another version in which Sears did not have to die when it did, in which the company's real estate, its brand assets, and its supplier relationships had enough residual value to support a more gradual transition, and in which the specific decisions made by its controlling shareholder accelerated the collapse in ways that benefited his own entities at the expense of the company's creditors and the workers whose pension fund was left underfunded. That version also exists. It is the version that the bankruptcy estate's lawyers developed in the course of their litigation, and it produced a settlement of $175 million. Both versions may contain truth. The specific allocation of responsibility between ordinary retail failure and deliberate value extraction is the question that a settlement, by definition, leaves unresolved. Lampert did not admit wrongdoing. The estate recovered a fraction of the losses. What is not disputed is who bore the cost. The 317,000 people whose jobs disappeared between 2005 and 2018 bore it. The retirees whose pension payments were reduced bore it. The suppliers who were left with unpaid invoices when the bankruptcy was filed bore it. The communities where the store closures left retail vacancies that anchor tenant departures create. The specific emptying of suburban shopping malls that became a feature of American commercial life in the 2010s. Those communities bore it. The people who made the decisions that produced this outcome bore it differently. The performance fees were paid and kept. The Seritage real estate appreciated. The lawsuit settled for 1.5% of the losses. This is not a story unique to Sears. It is the story of how a specific kind of financial engineering works when it is applied to legacy retail institutions. Acquire control of a distressed but asset-rich company. Extract the assets through transactions with your own entities. Accept that the operating company will decline, and purchase the remaining assets from the bankruptcy at a discount. The workers who lose their jobs in this process are described as victims of market forces. The pension deficits they are left with are absorbed by federal insurance programs. The communities where the stores close are left to manage the vacancy. The controlling shareholder lives in a compound in Miami Beach worth $38 million. This is not illegal. It is, in many of its particulars, within the rules that govern how businesses in financial distress are managed by their controlling shareholders. The rules were designed to allow companies to be restructured, assets to be repositioned, and value to be preserved through difficult periods. Whether the rules produce the outcomes they were designed to produce is the question that the Sears story raises and that the bankruptcy settlement did not answer. Richard Sears started with unclaimed watches on a railroad platform in 1886 because he saw that there were people who needed something, and a system that was failing to connect them with what they needed. The company that descended from that observation connected the American middle class with the material goods of their lives for 130 years. The people who ended it were not interested in connecting anyone with anything. They were interested in the real estate. Richard Sears, the railroad agent who turned unclaimed watches into a company, died in 1914 at the age of 50. He was not wealthy by the standards of the Gilded Age titans, because he had sold his interest in the company before the full scale of what he had built was apparent. Julius Rosenwald, who built what Sears started, became one of the great American philanthropists of the early 20th century, funding schools for black children across the South at a time when state governments refused to do so. He spent the last years of his life systematically giving away the fortune Sears had generated. The Sears Tower stood as the tallest building in the world for 25 years. The catalogue that preceded Amazon by a century is gone. The Craftsman tools are someone else's. The DieHard batteries are someone else's. The Kenmore brand is licensed to whoever will pay for it. Eddie Lampert lives in a compound in Miami Beach that is valued at approximately $38 million. He continues to operate ESL Investments. He maintains that he did his best for Sears. The 5 remaining stores are in places you have probably never heard of. The watches that started it all were pocket watches, the kind that men carried to know the time in an era before everyone had a clock in their hand. Nobody carries pocket watches anymore. The company that started with them has almost nothing left either. What happened between those two facts is the story of how an institution that served the American middle class for a century was acquired by a man who understood its value better than anyone, and extracted that value while the institution declined, and then bought what was left when the decline was complete. The American middle class built Sears over 130 years. It took 13 years to dismantle it. The question of who that 13 years was good for has a clear answer in the public record. It was not the 317,000 workers.